Now, Dr. Kirkwood.
So this is lesson 6, and we've entitled this lesson, The Biologic Argument, or How Molly Dissolves Evolution. And you're going to find out who Molly is tonight, and you're going to find out how she helps to dissolve evolution in her own little way. But evolution is the materialist, I label this the materialist only hammer. Now, if you don't know what that expression means, when I was in medical school, we had a internal medicine doctor that said that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Toby probably has heard this in school. I don't know if all medical schools get that or not. What does he mean by that? Dr. Olson meant by that you have to have more than just a hammer in your little black doctor's box, so that you don't treat everything as a nail. Well, as far as the evolutionist is concerned, the materialist is concerned, evolution is really their only explanation. It's the only explanation I've ever heard from them on how life began and how life has evolved to the point that it is now. And it's only evolution. Now, there's variations of the theory of evolution. They've had to come up with variations of evolution because of some of the things we're going to talk about today. The problem is none of those variations, whether it be what's called punctuated equilibrium or punctuated evolution, where they try to advance evolution by leaps, or salutation it's called, none of those really pan out scientifically, and there's no scientific proof for it, just as there's no scientific proof for evolution. But evolution still remains the main core, the main mechanism for life and for change. And for that reason, that the materialist, the evolutionist, the atheist has to explain life. And so that's why we're going to look at that in some detail. The first thing we need to know, though, and I think most of you know this, is that there's really two definitions of evolution. Now, when I speak and you're speaking of evolution, we're thinking of macroevolution. Macroevolution is the idea of large changes, where a frog becomes a rabbit, something like that. I'm making it real ridiculous, but you understand what I'm saying. These are large changes. That's called macroevolution. It's also sometimes referred to as the molecules to man concept, with the idea that life began by chemical processes. We've already talked about that in this class. Those chemical processes eventually produce some amino acids, which eventually produce proteins, which eventually produce some form of life, and then that one source of life began the process of evolution. So keep two definitions of evolution in mind, because microevolution equals small changes. And I like to use the word, and a lot of creationists like to use the word, adaptation. And there is ample proof that microevolution occurs. Adaptation is it's a real thing. It's not just a scientific theory. We see adaptation historically. We see adaptation even going on in animals and life today. Look at the idea of the evolution that occurs in a bacterium, how they evolve into resistant organisms. And that will be offered up as a proof that evolution is real. Well, it is real. It's microevolution, though. That bacteria never becomes anything else. I saw a lecture on YouTube not too many months ago with Danny Faulkner and some other, they were intelligent design people, but they were obviously intelligent design people that believed in evolution. And their arguments, all to Danny Faulkner, who's an astrophysicist, who is a young Earth creationist, were all microevolution arguments. They weren't macroevolution arguments. I remember one of the PhD speakers, she used the bacterium as an example. That's not what we talk about when we talk about evolution. So we'll use words, and it can get confusing, so you have to know what you're talking about and who you're talking to. But microevolution is adaptation. And what you're going to find out tonight, and this is fairly new stuff from Michael Behe, and that is the best argument against evolution is evolution. That's the best argument against evolution. And that's what we're going to talk about. Microevolution is the best argument against macroevolution. And we're going to give reasons for that as we go forward. So nobody believes that microevolution is not true. It is true, and we see it all around us. So back again to Darwin. Darwin believed that life came from one source. We've already talked about that. He believed that if enough chemicals were in some little pond and the little pond were struck by lightning, then out would pop some amino acids or whatever, proteins, and life would burst forth. That's what he believed. And he believed from that one source begat all life. So everything that we see around us today all had its beginnings at one source. And that's still the concept held by evolutionists. Where did he come up with this idea? How did he determine this idea? What made him think that this was possible? Well, he was on a long voyage on the Beetle. It was a ship that was going basically around the world in South America, and went to the Galapagos Islands. And on these islands, he saw many different animals, actually. The one that gets the most publicity are the finches, the little birds. And what Darwin observed is that the finches looked different on the various islands. They weren't the same. They were finches, but their size was different, their coloring was different, their beaks were different, and he theorized from that evolution or change had occurred that made these birds change through a process of time and adaptation, change their characteristics to be able to eat better and survive better. That was one of the things he looked at. But if you read the book On the Origin of Species, the book that began it all way back in 1859, he also looked at domestic animals in his homeland of England. So he looked at animals such as pigeons, he looked at cattle, he looked at dogs, he looked at various domestic animals, and he looked at the various breeds of these animals and how they could be, there was a wide variation within these breeds. And that was another proof for his theory of evolution. Well, I think you can see where we're going with this. Were those proofs of evolution? Those were proofs of adaptation. They were not proofs of evolution, but what Darwin theorized is if none of these little changes occurred, then a different animal could be produced. And so there's a little, that's kind of a very famous picture of these various finches and their beaks and how different they were. Interestingly, they've gone back to the Galapagos Islands, and because of weather changes, these changes can occur very rapidly. These birds can change their beaks and their colors pretty rapidly, and they seem to go back towards a mean. There's various breeds of cattle. We just pulled this up off the internet. You see the Longhorn there, and the Hereford, and the Angus, and the Red Angus, and all these other breeds, the Shorthorn, and the Brahma. These are just all breeds of animals, but the point is this is part of the, quote, proof of evolution that Darwin gave. So what produced these changes per Darwin? Natural selection and survival of the fittest. And Darwin is given credit for that, but it really wasn't Darwin. It was Russell Wallace who really came up with the concept of natural selection. But what Darwin theorized was when animals were in certain conditions where a certain condition favored a certain characteristic with that animal, natural selection would select out the inferior animals and the superior animals would survive. Let's just use the example of a giraffe. Well, everybody knows giraffes have real long necks. Where the trees are very tall, the long-necked giraffes are more likely to survive than the short-necked giraffes, right? That's natural selection. Still a giraffe, but it's natural selection and survival of the fittest, and the same kind of concept. The fittest will survive, those animals that are strongest will survive, and that's why we see, again, the evolution of the bacterium. The ones that can survive the antibiotics are the ones that are resistant to the antibiotics are the ones that are going to survive. These are not real far out concepts, are they? Natural selection, survival of the fittest, I would say, are probably valid concepts. But what Darwin did not have for this change, he didn't know how this change occurred. He just thought it did. He had no mechanism for that change. He sort of believed in Lamarckian genetics, and that is that you could inherit acquired characteristics, which nobody believes now, although you read some people, you think that they do. But Lamarck believed that, just as an example, if you cut the arm off of a person, their offspring might be born with no arm. Now that sounds stupid, doesn't it? But that concept was still around, or that concept was around when Darwin was there. Now I'm making it real gross, lost arm, but that was kind of the concept of Lamarckian genetics. But he didn't have a real good mechanism for these change. And then He had no proof for it either. He saw no proof at all, none, for his theory. His evidence was just looking at the animals, looking at the finches, looking at the dogs and the cats and the cattle and so forth. He had no proof for it. And he had no evidence for this other than, again, the evidence of microevolution, which we talked about. But what was his hope? What was Darwin hoping for when he began his theory of evolution? He was hoping that that evidence would occur. And where would this evidence come from? Since the process of evolution, per evolutionist, per Darwin, takes a long period of time. It occurs over millions of years. Species don't change shortly as far as changing from one kind to another. Now we're going to use the word species, we're going to use the word kind. And species you have to be careful with because last time I checked there were 1,200 species of bats. They're still bats. So when we talk about species, we're really, as creationists, we're talking about really kinds, difference in kinds. So species vary and species pop up and species die, but kinds don't change, which we will look at. But what did Darwin need? He needed something in the fossil record to prove or to show evidence for these big changes. And here's the deal, as you might can imagine. If it takes millions of years for these animals to change, shouldn't the fossil evidence be rather significant? Because you've got literally millions of animals that are developing to turn from one kind to another kind. The fossil record should be replete. And it was not replete with evidence during Darwin's time. He thought it was just a matter of time that it would be found. He died before that evidence was found. Guess what? If he was still alive today, he still wouldn't have found it. It's not out there. But that's what he thought. He thought the reason there wasn't evidence for his theory was simply because it just hadn't been found yet. It would eventually be found in the fossil record. And if it was never found in the fossil record, I think even Darwin would have a problem with his theory. So, with the discovery of DNA, which we've looked at in depth now, he now had, or not Darwin necessarily, but his predecessors, the ones that come after him, the scientists that came after Darwin now had a mechanism for change because they understood DNA. And that DNA was the language of life, as we talked about. And that a mutation in that DNA could result in the change in the animal or organism. And those mutations could be passed on to other progeny. Therefore, now you had a mechanism for the change of the organism. Now, I'm going to tell you, that's true. I was taught back in high school that, no, this couldn't happen. But that's true. Not taught by biologists, but by Christians, that mutations were so rare they could never be beneficial. We're going to see that's not necessarily true tonight, but this is the mechanism for change. It is the change in the DNA, and the term for that now is neo-Darwinism. So when you see the concept neo-Darwin, it's Darwinists now have this mutation as the change in the organism. And although beneficial mutations are rare, they still occur. So the concept that mutations could never be propagated to the next generation, that's not a true concept because they are and they can be. What we're going to see though is they don't result in a new kind, and that's the most important thing in tonight's lesson. So over vast time, species could change into different kinds, and I kind of use those two words there in that same sentence on purpose, so you'll understand the concept. Species are one thing, kinds are another, and we'll discuss that in detail in just a minute. But over enough time, millions and millions of years, a rabbit could turn into a pig, something like that, given enough time. So proof? No, there's not any proof. So just why don't we believe this? I just threw that in there just to make a quick comment. That is, why do so many people like us not believe in the theory of evolution? Well, this class is to show you that it's not just a faith thing. It's not just a young earth creationist thing, but it's a scientific reason for not believing in it. But if you don't believe in evolution, and I'm paraphrasing Richard Dawkins here, and I'm giving a little credit to a deceased colleague of mine, Dr. V.O. Spate, who passed away last year, but I once heard him give a prayer where he used the word please, Lord, may people not look on us as freaks, fools, and fanatics. Well, you have to be a freak, fool, or fanatic to not believe in evolution, according to Richard Dawkins. And I do paraphrase from Richard Dawkins, but that's basically what he says. That if you don't believe in molecules to man evolution, you're either a freak, and I don't know, you're just crazy, in other words. You're a fool, meaning you're stupid, or you're just a fanatic young earth creationist, and you're not going to see the light of evolution. None of that obviously is true. And so as a result, we just need to throw intelligence out the door looking at evolution, I suppose. The scientific evidence is not there. The truth is, macroevolution is simply not scientific. There's no proof that kinds turn into different kinds. There is no proof in the scientific record, and there's no proof in the laboratory. There's no proof at all for macroevolution. So whenever you get especially for young people here, if you're exposed to biology teachers or whatever, and they're trying to offer up the proof for evolution, try to have them give you one example of continuous evolution where one kind turned into another kind. Proof from the fossil record, proof from the laboratory. And the point is, they can't do it. There was a documentary that's out that I've looked at before where they've actually go to, I think it's USC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And they're interviewing some professors there, and they're all talking about evolution, and they want to know proof of evolution. And every time they gave an answer, it was always back to the microevolution. It was just always, well, there's just thousands of cases of proofs for evolution. Well, just give me one. Over and over, the interviewer kept saying, just give me one. That's all I'm asking for, one. And they never did. It was all microevolution. And actually, the fossil record actually disproves evolution. Not only doesn't prove it, it basically disproves it. Probably the most talked about example of the fossil record that disproves evolution is the so-called Cambrian layer. And I'm sure you've probably heard this, but it doesn't hurt to hear it again. The Cambrian layer. Now, I'm not necessarily saying I believe in the geologic column. We'll talk about the geologic column here, and that's the supposed column where animals and the lower part of that column first evolved, and then you got, as time progresses, you got another group of animals that evolve, and then another group of animals that evolve, and that's the whole concept of geologic column. And I can tell you right now, nowhere on the face of this planet does the geologic column exist as you see in textbooks. It doesn't. Bits and pieces maybe, but as it's portrayed in textbooks, it's nowhere to be found. It sort of it requires a little bit of imagination. But let's just say for the record here that we're going to accept, for the sake of argument, that we're going to accept the geologic column as it's portrayed in those textbooks. Well, the earliest column is really where life really begins, is the Cambrian layer. Now there is a pre-Cambrian layer where virtually nothing is found. Virtually nothing is found, but the most important one is the Cambrian layer. And it was found actually during Darwin's time. Darwin actually studied the Cambrian layer. The word Cambrian comes from the name for Wales. And Wales, as you know, is in England, and Darwin studied those fossils that were there. In the North American continent, it was in British Columbia at the Burgess Shale Formation. And that shouldn't be 1997, I think that should be 1917. So it's a mistake on the time, but it's Dr. Charles Walcott of the Smithsonian Institute went up there and studied these shells. He studied them extensively, and he took lots of samples from the Burgess Shale Formation, and this was the Cambrian layer that he was studying. Now, I wrote in the paper that you've got, interesting side note, Charles Walcott understood almost immediately what he had found and the implications thereof. And those samples were never really displayed at the Smithsonian. They were kind of hid, and we're talking about tens of thousands of samples of those animals that he found that were part of this Cambrian layer, because he knew the implication of that. And here's the problem with the Cambrian layer. You see sudden appearances. There's about 23 animal phyla in the Cambrian layer, and these are marine animals. For the most part. I think they're all marine animals. But what you see in the Cambrian layer are 23 very distinct phyla, or types of animals that don't look anything like each other, and yet they're distinct. What you don't see is anything in the Precambrian layer that leads up to this. It's called the Cambrian explosion. And what's the explanation from a evolutionist point of view on that? Well, they don't really have a good one. They've got all kinds of things. Well, maybe it goes back to Darwin. It goes back to Darwin. We probably just haven't discovered those fossils yet. Now, we've discovered Precambrian fossils, we've discovered Cambrian fossils, we've discovered all the other geologic layer fossils, but we haven't found the ones that occurred before the Precambrian. It doesn't make sense. They just exploded on the scene. And according to evolutionary theory, that shouldn't be. There should have been precursors. Lots of precursors. This is very crude. It's a schematic drawing. Now, we don't have any of these animals around now. They're extinct. All these animals are extinct. But I don't know if this includes all 23 or not. But it kind of gives you an idea of what they look like. What I did bring was this little thing right here. This probably won't show up on our YouTube. Anybody got an idea what that is? Yeah, it's a trilobite. We picked this up, Pam and Marvin and Cherry and I were on vacation in Europe a couple of years ago. I can't remember what city this was in, but I found one of these things. Actually, they had, this is, I guess you could call it a baby trilobite. This is in the Precambrian layer. That's what, in the Cambrian layer, excuse me. This was found in the Cambrian layer. Now, it may not look like much of an animal to you, but it's got ribs and it's got little places where the eyes were, and I think I got a schematic drawing of this. Kind of looks like a horseshoe crab. I would call the trilobite kind of the hero of the Cambrian layer for creationists, because where did its precursors come, or where are the precursors for this animal? And this, trust me, this is a very complex animal. This is not a microscopic animal. This is small, but I mean, we saw some of these trilobites were that big. And apparently you can pick them up all over the place if you go to the Burgess Shale even today. So this animal is a very, very complex animal with zero precursors. Evolution has no good explanation for this. They have none. So the Cambrian layer is a big enigma, if you want to use a fancy word, for the evolutionists. They will deny it, and that's no big enigma. You know, there's reasons why we don't have those fossils. Walcott he came up with a story that regression had taken the precursors out, and they're all out in the sea, in the beds of the sea. And these are arguments of ignorance. That's what they are. They're not explanatory, but they're just arguments of ignorance. That's what they are. And so this gives you an idea of what the geologic column is supposed to look like. Now, here's the problem that's not talked about very often. And that is this same phenomenon. Again, we're going to assume that the geologic column is real for the sake of argument. This same argument, or this same problem, the enigma that we see in the Cambrian layer, is seen in every geologic column. Where are the precursors? Let's just use the Jurassic column there, which, you know, everybody knows about Jurassic Park. That's where the dinosaurs were or found and so forth. I want to know where the precursors to those dinosaurs are. Where's the precursor to the Tyrannosaurus Rex? Where are the ones that come before him or her? Or the Brontosaurus? Every geologic column has this same generic problem. There are no precursors. When these animals show up, they show up fully formed and fully what they are. Now, there's a wide variation, you know, just like you have a little trilobite, big trilobite, wide variation, but they're still the same animals. And you see that in every supposed geologic layer. It's the same phenomenon, and they have no precursors. Even if we look at man, this is the old missing link. I remember growing up in school thinking, they're going to find the missing link. They're going to find the missing link. Let me tell you, every fossil of humans or humanoids that have been found to date are either pure or easily identified as humans, or they're easily identified as primates. There's no missing link. So when you see a picture like this, it's a fraudulent picture. It is made up by man. There is no progression from a chimpanzee to an upright man in the fossil record. It's all made up. And yet, virtually every textbook I've ever seen has this picture or something similar to this picture in it. And it's just not true. So has that missing link been found? No, it has not been found. Nothing remotely like a missing link has been found. They're just stories. That's all they are. Well, how about Neanderthal? No, Neanderthal's a missing link. No, he's not. Neanderthal's a man. And everybody that has studied Neanderthal now realizes that Neanderthal probably lived in an area of Europe where they didn't have a lot of vitamin C. They probably had vitamin D, rickets. And as a result of that, shorter than normal, but their cranial capacity was the same as yours. And there's been people that say, if you were to see a Neanderthal today walking in downtown Manhattan, you'd never blink an eye. You know, you say, oh, it's a little bit odd looking guy, but just a little bit odd. And there's people that I've seen that look Neanderthal to me. There's actors that look Neanderthal. They cast them in roles like that for a reason. So, microevolution is a fact. It happens. Adaptation occurs, and it's all around us. We see it all over the place. I would not dispute that with any evolutionist. Microevolution equals change. Animals do change. I'm going to show you a few pictures here in just a minute where animals do change. The Galapagos finches are not an argument for macroevolution. They're just not. Neither are the domesticated animals in England or Scotland or America or anywhere else. They are examples of adaptation, but they are not examples of macroevolution. And mutations on occasion can be beneficial. Rare though they be, when they're beneficial, almost always they're detrimental, but occasionally they can be beneficial. And again, this is something that I was not taught before, but Michael Behe in his book Darwin Devolves gives an excellent examples of these, and we'll talk about some of these in just a minute. But here's the most important thing that I want you to know about mutations, and even beneficial mutations. When a mutation occurs, when a beneficial mutation occurs, what you have is a decrease in genetic information. Something is taken away from that animal. And that animal doesn't have as much genetic information as it had before that mutation occurred. It's a decrease in genetic mutation. What does evolution require? Revolution demands an increase in genetic information, not a decrease in it. And so there's a problem there, isn't it? When you see mutations that are beneficial, again, though they be rare, they are a result in a decrease in genetic material. The more we learn about science, and the reason this is fairly new is we didn't know about this even 20 years ago. This is new stuff that's not being taught. But Behe talks about it in his book. This is new stuff. A couple of weekends ago, I was at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, and Michael Denton was there, and he was speaking. Michael Denton wrote Evolution of Theories in Crisis back in I guess the early 90s or so. It's probably the book that started the intelligent design movement. And now he's been around a while. He's probably in his late 70s, but still bright, still brilliant. And he made a comment there, and he's a very educated man, MD, PhD in genetics, so he knows what he's talking about. And he made the comment that the more and more and more that he finds out in science or discovers in science, the more and more it disproves evolution and improves God, or improves an intelligent design. And these are the kind of things we're now finding out about mutations and adaptation. It's a decrease in information, and evolution demands an increase for a species to change. And here's the thing, the adaptation mechanism has limits. It can only go so far. And this is another relatively new finding, is that yes, you can have adaptation, you can have change, but a dog can only get so little. These are not a great picture there, but in the middle I think you see a little tiny Chihuahua, and then right above it is a German Shepherd. There's bigger dogs and smaller dogs than that. But you have limits to change. We don't have a really good picture here, but we got one of these are various zebras, horses, which are in the same family. And they are now breeding horses so small that you can raise them in a Manhattan apartment like a dog, believe it or not. And you have Clydesdales that are so big that no normal trailer could carry them. And I don't know if the Clydesdale is the biggest horse or not, but it's certainly one of the biggest. The point is, horses can only get so little and they can only get so big. There's a limit to their adaptation. Now we use adaptation. Adaptation is the reason for these changes in domestic animals, although in those cases, mankind is forcing that adaptation. So it's not evolution necessarily that's forcing it, but it's there. And the fossil record is in agreement with this. That's why we see what we see in the fossil record. And I believe this is a biblical concept. this idea of kinds. Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was so. And this refers back to the story of Noah. Of the birds after their kind, or the animals after their kind, and every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, two of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. Why did Noah need two? He needed a male and a female, right? Because kinds breed together. That's what kinds do. They can produce offspring. And that's, to me, why Noah needed two of every kind, and not two of every variety of kind. He didn't need necessarily a tiger and a lion and a jaguar and so forth. He needed a cat kind. He didn't need every dog. He didn't need the wolf. He didn't need the coyote. He didn't need necessarily the jackal, because there's a lot of variety in these kinds. So people that look at it, there's no way that the ark could have held all those animals. What you don't understand is he didn't need every type of species. He needed every type of kind. Now, we may not always be able to differentiate one kind from another. God does, obviously. But in man's nomenclature, we might not know that. But kinds don't become other kinds. And so how would you define kind? At least one way to define it, I would find, if breeding. If two animals can breed together and produce offspring, to me they have to be of the same kind. That makes sense, doesn't it? Now, you can't limit it to that, because you can cause the organism to have so much variety that one of the same kind may not be able to breed with another kind, but they're still of the same kind. For example, I don't know if a house cat would be able to breed with a lion. I don't know if that's possible or not, but yet they could still be the same kind. So it's not the only thing, but clearly if two animals can breed together, they have to be of the same kind. I would argue that. And here's some simple examples. These are real examples. These are not made up pictures. The top one is the liger. Well, what's that? Well, lion bred with a tiger. It's of the same. So I would make the deduction that tigers and lions are of the same kind, wouldn't you? Then we have the Z-donk. Donk Z, they call them different things. That's an animal that is half zebra and half donkey. Well, what would I deduce from that? I would deduce that a donkey and a zebra are of the same kind. And then the wolf dog, I think most people know this, but a wolf could breed with a domestic dog and you would have a wolf dog. That would tell me that a wolf and a domestic dog are of the same kind, and we could go on and on with this. But here's what we don't see. We don't see a bird dog. We don't see that happening. These are kind of silly, but they give the point. We don't see a giraffe turtle. You just don't see that. You don't see a turtle turning into a giraffe or mating with a giraffe, and you don't see a zebrant. You don't see a zebra turning in or breeding with an ant. You don't see that. So God ultimately defines kinds, not us. But sometimes it's rather obvious. Feline and the dog kind, the cattle kind, the horse kind, I think we can see that. Man doesn't make this ultimate decision. So where do we fall in here? This is the scientific classifications. Have been around for hundreds of years. And it's interesting, Michael Behe originally thought, he put the word kind in the area of order. That he changed his mind. He doesn't believe that anymore. Now, when I read his book, Edge of Evolution, I had a problem with his book. I'm saying he's got kinds in the wrong spot. With his new book, he puts it at the level of the family, and that's where I would put it. The family Euceta there is the bear family, and then if you get down into the polar bear and brown bear, then you get into the genus and then the actual species. And I'm not dogmatic on that, but for the most part, I would look at family. Just like I talked about earlier, there's probably 1,200 different kinds of species of bats. You see this all over. So in essence, Darwin got something right. Adaptation does occur. And so look at the fossil record. Everybody's heard of the woolly mammoth. You see a woolly mammoth today? But what do you see? An elephant. It adapted into an elephant, and it was able to survive better under the right conditions as an elephant. Same thing with a saber-toothed tiger. I haven't seen a saber-toothed tiger They're dead, they're extinct, but tigers are still around. That's a Bengal tiger beside it. And then we get to the polar bear. Now, this is to Dr. Behe's points. The polar bear, you could see why a polar bear could adapt to a very white climate, couldn't you, if it had white fur? Be able to hide from predecessors and hide from the people, the animals it wants to feed on a lot easier. But there's a bigger mutation that occurs in the polar bear, and that's the APOB gene. Toby knows what this is because we have this gene in us. This mutation in this gene allowed the polar bear to survive on fat, whereas the brown bear couldn't eat the same food and would not be able to survive. And it gave the polar bear not only the white color, but this mutation in this certain gene, an advantage over the brown bear. But it did it at a loss of genetic material. It was due to the damage of that gene that caused this. So the polar bear, in essence, was devolving. Not evolving, devolving. And this is my favorite picture here. Anybody know what that is? That's Molly. That's my dog. This is a white lab. She's a European or British lab. We've had her for about a year. If you looked at her, you say, yeah, she's a beautiful animal. She's highly pedigreed, which she is. You say, wow, that's an improvement in the species by getting to a dog that looks this wonderful. Wouldn't you say that? I would. And Labradors were bred for a reason. Labradors were bred to be retrievers. If you have labs, you know that they have webbed feet. What does webbed feet allow them to do? They are able to jump in the water, swim after fish. They came from Newfoundland originally, where they actually retrieve fish, not birds. Now we use them more to retrieve birds, I think, than we do fish. So they were bred for this very reason, to be able to retrieve, and they're really good at it. My dog will retrieve anything. You know, she loves doing that. It's in their genes, quote unquote. It's in their genetics to do that. But what's the cost of that? Turns out it's a lot. And if you know anything about the Labrador breeds, and this is true of any domestic dog, by the way, I'm not picking on labs, but if whatever dog you have, it's been bred for a reason to be what that dog is, and they have problems. All these breeds have problems. Look at all these problems labs have: hip dysplasia, elbow dysplasia, cataracts, retinal dysplasia, myopathy, epilepsy, pulmonary stenosis, tricuspid valve dysplasia, hypothyroidism, diabetes, digestive problems, on and on and on. So it's bred to look like it looks and to do what it does, but at a loss of genetic information, which makes them more exposed to this kind of stuff. So in essence, my dog is a mutant degenerate. And so is yours. That's just the facts. How about animal? How about human beings? Is there something similar to this in human beings? There are things similar to this in human beings, and this is the sickle cell gene. Sickle cell anemia is the result of one mutation out of hundreds of the hemoglobin molecule. Just one. It's one little mutation. Now, only a couple of us are doctors in here, but does anybody know anything good about having sickle cell? No, it's a bad disease, right? It's a bad disease. Don't raise your hand. You're going to steal my thunder. No. No, the sickle cell is a bad thing, and I'm not making fun of sickle cell. It's bad. If you get the full sickle cell gene, your life expectancy is decreased because as a result of this gene mutation, your hemoglobin is sticky, and it causes vascular occlusion, strokes, seizures. It's not a good thing. But the sickle cell gene protects against malaria. So there is a place in the world where having sickle cell gene, or especially the sickle cell trait, actually is a beneficial thing if you lived in a place of malaria. We don't have malaria here, do we? Really don't see that. But we know that the sickle cell gene helps protect against malaria. So this will be our last slide for the day, because Norris just gave me this. There may be one more. This is a great quote. I love this quote from Michael Behe. The quickest way for Darwinian evolution to mitigate a problem is to break something. So the quickest way for animals to adapt is to break something, mutation. The result is not evolution, it's de-evolution. Have you seen a new kind anytime in the last 50 years? No, and you're not going to. Have you seen kinds that are no longer here? Yeah, we see extinction Extinction's all around us, and every year they put out another list of animals that are on the extinct list or in the endangered list, but we don't see them evolving. We see de-evolution. So it has taken a century and a half to realize it. That's why I say this is new material. It has taken a century and a half to realize it, but random mutations and natural selection are self-limiting. They don't produce different kinds. All right, thank you. Appreciate it.